They were expected home by Sunday evening. No one heard from them again. 14 years later, on a wind-scoured plain, where the grass snaps like brittle wire and the horizon runs in a straight line forever, a burned-out caravan, half buried in drifts of tan sand and stove-black ash, gave up a secret that should have been impossible to keep. This is the story of how a small, ordinary plan collapsed into silence, how roads were driven and redrawn around that silence, and how heat, metal, and time tried to erase the Dawson family until the evidence refused to stay dead. Late autumn, high country, air thin and clean as glass. Mark and Ellen Dawson loaded their caravan before dawn. With a compact list on the counter, a neighbor tasked to feed the cat, and a dented thermos rinsed and ready, their daughter, 9 years old, slept under a quilt as the engine turned over. The route was simple: south along the spine of the Front Range, then west into mesas and piñon breaks, where the wind never stops talking. Their caravan, second-hand, sun-faded, patched around the seams, carried enough water for 2 days, and a conviction that maps could keep trouble small. The first hours went as planned. They stopped for fuel where the pumps whined and the receipts printed pale and crooked. A convenience store camera caught their faces in the ghost glass of the cooler door. Mark adjusting a knit hat, Ellen raising a paper cup, and the girl bundled in a blanket patterned with small blue moons. After that, the digital trail thinned to nothing, swallowed by a country that shrugs off signal and keeps its own counsel. By Monday morning, the neighbor stood on the porch with cat food in hand and a feeling like a static building under the skin. Calls rolled to voicemail. A check with Ellen's employer produced polite confusion that hardened into concern by noon. A patrol car eased down the street at dusk, lights off, engine ticking. The officer knocked anyway, because that's what you do when the ordinary rhythm misses a beat. Inside, everything was as it should be. Milk in the fridge, tools lined on a pegboard, no note on the counter, no travel drama scribbled on a calendar, just the quiet of a house between breaths. The search moved quickly at first, because the first hours are a debt you never get back. Dispatch pushed a bolo across counties that understand distance differently. Rangers at the far edge of the high desert took down the make, model, and license plate that would become a prayer. They widened the circle, checked trailhead lots where the wind stacks grit against tire sidewalls like a signature, and peered down canyon pullouts where the world falls away all at once. By the third day, a joint command post went up in a fairgrounds building whose concrete floors hold the cold like a memory. Maps on easels acquired highlighter scars. Volunteers signed their names and handed over a slice of hope with their driver's licenses. A helicopter drummed at first light, lifting over a landscape that hates to be read from above. It came back with images of dirt roads like gray veins, stock ponds slick with ice, and a shining thread of river shrugging through bends. Nothing that could be called a clue. The Dawson family's phone records offered the comfort of procedure, and nothing else. A last ping near a ridge, whose name points at the sky, and then nothing, as if the devices chose to sleep. The credit cards went quiet. At the same time, the weather shifted. A front rattled the windows and laid down a thin powder that redrew every track. A tire factory's lot camera that might have shown a turning signal was fogged and blind. Too many maybes and not enough ground. Red herrings multiplied because that is what fear does to data. A social media post from a roadside diner 2 counties away featured a caravan with a similar roofline. It turned out to be 3 years old and geotagged wrong. A rumor said a group of prospectors saw a campfire where no fire should have been. They were off by 16 miles and 4 days. A fisherman swore he heard a child crying in a cottonwood draw, a sound that followed him into his dreams and refused to be true when dogs worked the grid and found only the musk of a fox. By the second week, the search slowed the way a heart does when you're very tired. The helicopters were grounded by a ceiling that would not lift. Ground teams pushed into breaks where juniper claws at sleeves and draws funnel cold into your boots. The command post smelled like coffee that had boiled too long and wool damp from melted snow. They found a campsite flattened by wind years ago, a rusted bed frame, and a broken bottle that caught the light like a signal. "Not this time," someone said, and folded the map a different way. Back in the cul-de-sac, the mailbox filled, then emptied under a neighbor's quiet hand. Paper cranes appeared on the porch rail, the way hope manifests when language fails. An out-of-state reporter came once, wrote a piece that treated distance like a villain, and left when the story refused to resolve on deadline. Winter pressed down. The case slid into a file cabinet drawer where dust keeps score. Years accrued. New roads went in. Gates swung open and shut across BLM parcels where the signs warn that help is far and time is slower than you think. The Dawsons became a sentence people finished with a question mark. People move on. Paper does not. In the 12th year, a small grass fire ran a fence and licked at the edge of an arroyo. Volunteer crews contained it by midnight, blacklining the rim. A week later, a hunter followed the burn scar, not for answers, but because burned country reads like a book. Tracks, old trash, and the gossip of heat. He came around a bend and saw metal, not new metal, but metal that had been to war with heat and lost. A caravan collapsed in on itself. Skin puckered and flaked, frame warped into curves that weren't there before. Sand had blown half a wall into a dune against it. In the middle, an oval of ash. Not what wood makes, but the fine, slate-gray sift that comes when plastic, wiring, and insulation go to pieces. He stood longer than he meant to, listening for the sound that emptiness makes. Then he did the only thing that counted. He marked the coordinates on a crumpled topo and called it in. The response was small at first, because the country breeds caution. A sheriff's truck, a ranger who knows fire like a dialect. They kept their voices down on instinct and walked a perimeter that stone had already drawn. The wind trimmed their words to the bone. The ranger crouched where the heat had loaded a corner of the frame with an extra shine. In the hollow, something metallic winked under ash in the shape of a postcard. He brushed with 2 fingers and felt a rectangle give under the grit. He did not pull it free. He stood and backed away and called for a scene tech, because habits only matter when they are hard. The night came down clean. They left a battery lantern burning on the road's edge, a small star against a big sky, and posted a unit to wait for daylight and the right tools. Somewhere in the in-between, the wind shifted and laid a new skin of grit over old ash, smoothing everything to a blind continuity. In the morning, they would break that surface in the exact right places. They didn't know it yet, but in that ash, the past had not finished writing. At first light, the ash looked like water frozen mid-slosh, a subtle topography of ripples and hollows that would keep secrets if handled wrong. The perimeter went up in flagging, barely higher than a bootlace. A tripod for scene photos sank an inch into the soft shoulder and held. The lead tech walked it clockwise, with a camera and a checklist, narrating to a recorder, because you only ever get to touch a scene for the first time once. The burnt caravan sat canted in a shallow swale, tongue twisted, axle collapsed, the kind of posture bodies take when they've been asked to hold weight they weren't built for. They started with air. A hand pump drew headspace into tubes, because even after years, burned ground can keep the memory of vapors in pockets the wind missed. Soil cores came next, taken at cardinal points under the frame and in a grid beyond, capped and labeled in a rhythm that would read like a metronome later. A magnet raked the ash and tapped like a clock against the smallest things: screws, spring clips, and the beat of a zipper. The rectangle under the grit was coaxed up on a spatula, a warped card of thin aluminum, corners rounded, one edge blistered into bubbles where the heat had chased the alloy to its limit. Under soot and soot again lay stamped numbers not fully gone, a ghost of a series with gaps like missing teeth. They didn't cheer. They photographed it on a scale, and slid it into a paper envelope. The frame told its own story. For anyone who speaks metal. Heat lines ran in gradients the way the sun fades upholstery, darker where the flame hugged the shape, paler where the wind robbed heat, like a thief. In the belly, a puddled sheen of aluminum had flowed and set in slick drips that caught light like water glazed in winter. Foam insulation had gone to lace, the pattern of its absence like a negative of walls that once were. Where cabinetry had stood, a scatter of screws rested at right angles in the ash, heads blued, threads intact, a constellation marking space. If there had been fabric, it was now only a color that would stain a glove as a warning, and then be gone on the next brush of wind. They found glass, but not in the obvious forms. The windows had slumped into irregular saucers, edges rolled where surface tension held against collapse. In one bowl of glass, the tech noticed a ripple inside, a wavy distortion trapped at the bottom. He rotated it in the sun. Letters emerged as low relief, the faintest imprint of a decal once pressed against the pane. It was not a name, not a place, just compliance markings, which is to say, it was the truth, without a story attached. They bagged it anyway. Out beyond the frame, ash thin to soil that had been cooked but not transformed. A brittle line, a few fingers deep. Below that, the earth returned to its old smell, damp and mineral and indifferent. The ranger with the eye for fire walked the arc where flame must have run outward and then failed, kneeling to draw a fingertip across soot, to see whether the wind had shaped the burn or the fuel had. He sketched a shallow V with his palm and looked where it pointed. It pointed to where a door would have been if doors kept their shape in heat. They do not. He marked it on a slate and kept his thought in his pocket, because thoughts at scenes are like seeds in bad soil. Most do not take. A deputy worked the slope for tire impressions, though the years had been unkind to memory here. He came up with only the story of wind and small animals. A coyote had cut the swale last week, paws close together, body low. A human boot had not stood there in a long time. The serial card went first to a lab with acids and light, meant to tempt submerged numbers to the surface. Stamped metals, remember. When a number is pressed into a plate, the grain below changes, and that change can be coaxed up even after the top is sanded or burned. The technician bathed the aluminum, coaxed, rinsed, and photographed it. Numbers came back like a whisper half heard, and then became something you could write down without feeling foolish. She handed over a series 2 digits short of complete. While the lab courted metal, the investigation went backward and outward at once. Old reports were pulled, a decade's weight of paper that had waited for this exact day like a magnet buried in a field. The Dawson file still smelled like a government building. Toner and cardboard, and the faint, clean odor of air pushed through vents. In that file were map overlays with routes drawn and redrawn, a list of gas purchases that ended too early, and a short letter written in a careful hand by a 9-year-old to a teacher about rock formations she hoped to see, not evidence in the legal sense. Evidence in the human one. The chassis number, partial as it was, pressed into separate systems at once. Insurance, Department of Motor Vehicles, manufacturer archives for a model year long past its time in showrooms. There is a way these things go in modern cases. Fast and electronic, fields autofilling and flags set. Old cases require a different patience. A clerk in a back office sent a fax that produced a roll of thermal paper with a list of serials in a range that included theirs. The paper curled and wanted to be a circle. The detective held it flat with a hand that needed coffee. One entry was paired to a registered Caravan purchased in Colorado's western slope 6 years before the disappearance. No owner name was written in this narrative, because names where there's no indictment yet belong to moments later than this one. What mattered was a link that could be tested against the Dawson timeline like a fitted part. The soil analysis returned in 2 parts. First, the negatives. No gasoline range hydrocarbons above ambient. no kerosene carried by the wind, and no volatile signature that screams accelerant even to a machine. But there are fires that use no can, fires that come from a kind of hunger the scene itself feeds. The second part offered what science calls positive polymer residues consistent with interior finishes of a Caravan in that era. The chemistry, a fingerprint made from countertop, laminate, and foam. It was the sort of finding that doesn't point at a hand, but does suggest a room. Time is a predator and an archivist. There was a chance of biological evidence in the deeper pockets of ash, where heat had been high, but brief and oxygen hard to find. They built a small sifter and fed ash through with gloved hands, letting the finest particles fall and the things that had form remain. A button surfaced, not whole but half a hemisphere of plastic with a shallow crater where a shank used to be. A coin came up next, its face erased, but its mass intact. Rim serrations still catching against the mesh. The tech hummed through his teeth, an unconscious noise. Ash filled his sleeves like a threat. Then he felt the particular drag of something that is not rock. He lifted it on 2 fingers like a fragile bird and set it in a shallow tray. Curved, ivory in color, though that is not a color but a descriptive word in forensics. Tiny ridges are not random, but repeating in a way nature favors. He called it in, and the sifter stopped. The lab would later write a sentence structured in passive voice, the way they do when certainty is big and the writer smaller than the thing being described, a human phalanx. Distal, consistent with a child. The tech who had lifted it did not know the sentence yet. He knew only the weightless feel in his palm, and the way all the air around a scene can change temperature without the thermometer moving. Back at the office, a room that had held the Dawson maps opened again. They didn't mount anything yet. They cleared the table instead, spreading the photos of the Caravan like cards, where the rules of the game are terrible and simple. A pinned note enumerated the next steps. Expand the ash sifting grid by 1 meter. Request archival sales records from the distributor listed on the manufacturer reply. Compare the partial chassis series to prior leads suppressed for lack of corroboration. Pull dental records from the Dawson file for resubmission, because bones are calendars and teeth are diaries that never forget. The weather held cold and bright for 3 days, as if the sky had made an agreement to stay out of the way. In that window, they took a casting of a tire remnant fused to earth where rubber had gone fully black, and then further to char. The pattern would be hard to date or match, but the pattern itself is a story. A manufacturer's idea made physical and then undone by heat. It went into evidence with its own paper life and its own hope for relevance later. On the 4th morning, a call ran through 3 switchboards before it landed on the detective who had flattened curling paper. The manufacturer's archivist had found a sales blotter, handwritten and dated, with numbers that drank ink in the way certain paper stocks do. The serial before and after the partial he had read belonged to units shipped to a small dealer off a frontage road that time, and highway rerouting had made obsolete. The blotter carried a note, special order hitch reinforced. The next line carried something rarer, an owner signed in pencil and then pressed with a thumb because the pen wrote badly that day. The archivist's voice didn't change volume when he read it. He didn't need to. The name was a match to a bill of sale in the old file, a step toward anchoring a burned chassis to a family that left one morning meaning to come back. They carried that to the Caravan site like a talisman, and a burden both. Under the ash, in a pocket near where a sink might have been, the magnet clicked against the smallest ring of metal. The tech reached in and lifted a circle slick with soot and dull with years. It was a key ring, fused into an oval, and through it ran a thin figure-8 shadow where 2 keys had once been and now were something else entirely. He turned it gently. On the ring was a charm the size of a fingernail, melted but still bearing the impression of stars. Not evidence in a courtroom way yet, not a body, but a thing that had been chosen carried, and lost. He pulled his hand back and breathed out through his teeth until the shaking at the edges of his hands forgot its task. The next report in the pipeline would not be about metal or soil. It would be about an odorant bound into a piece of porous material found below the level of heavy burn, a chemical that survives heat in ways that confuse intuition and confirm presence. The lab would call and say a word that would tighten jaws in a command room. Phosphine-adjacent markers, suggestive of the decomposition environment prolonged at partial oxygen. That is a way of saying there had been bodies here, and they had been here long enough to turn the air into a record, but that call had not arrived yet. All they had, standing in a wind that still smelled faintly of something acrid and metallic even after years, was a partial cereal, a child's bone, and the shape of a truth trying to push itself through ash. The discovery of the small bone tilted everything. A cold case measured in years suddenly had blood heat again, though the language stayed clinical because that is how you keep the work from breaking its own workers. The fragment went straight to the forensic anthropology lab, packaged in a way that would keep every particle of ash stuck to it for analysis. Chain of custody forms multiplied. Initials on tape. The weight of signatures equal to the weight of the bone itself. The anthropologist placed it under magnification, running calipers across its curve. She didn't say the name of what she believed it to be. She wrote measurements and noted the absence of fusion lines and the angle of articulation. Then she stepped back and let the report say what she could not out loud. Consistent with a distal phalanx of a juvenile, age range 3 to 6 years. The Dawson daughter had been 4. That sentence moved across desks like a ripple of cold water. The timeline board reopened. The string, once pulled down, was now reattached to pins that hadn't moved in 14 years. Photos of the family, once yellowing on cork, were reprinted crisp. A vacation shot of the Dawsons smiling at a trailhead took a place of honor again, this time beside the image of warped aluminum and ash. The contrast was obscene in its precision. Attention shifted back to the Caravan itself. The fire specialist combed its bones for burn patterns, not of accident, but of intent. Accidental fires have a way of telling on themselves. Low origin, fuel-driven, chaotic spread. Intentional fires, especially those meant to erase, favor accelerants, multiple points of ignition, or attempts to conceal origin. In the Dawson Caravan, the patterns were ambiguous. The aluminum frame had slumped more on the left, suggesting heat concentrated there. But no chemical residues of accelerant were present in the soil. The specialist entertained a possibility rarely considered. A slow smolder from an electrical short, oxygen-starved, later accelerated when window seals gave way. But how then did an entire family vanish without a trace while their vehicle died in a fire? The question hung heavier than the smoke that had once risen here. Investigators widened the perimeter. A drone skimmed the slopes, capturing grids of terrain in high resolution, looking for disturbed soil that might suggest secondary burials. It saw only the geometry of erosion, gullies carved by thaw, and tracks of deer moving in patient single file. But drones are not infallible. Ground teams cut transects, boots falling in tempo, eyes downward, radios muttering coordinates. Hours became days. Nothing new surfaced. Meanwhile, analysts combed the partial serial numbers against the Dawson file again, looking for overlap. One entry struck like a hammer. A repair record from a small mechanic's shop near the canyon roads, dated 6 months before the family vanished. The record listed a reinforced hitch, the same as the manufacturer's blotter had noted. Payment in cash. The owner's name matched the file. That link was now more than a theory. It was documented. The shop owner, now long retired, was located in a small desert town. He remembered almost nothing until shown a photo of the Dawsons at a gas station. His eyes narrowed, then widened. "Yeah," he said, voice brittle. "They had a little girl. She sat on the counter and asked if she could have a soda while her dad signed the bill. He laughed. Said no, not before dinner. He smiled at the memory. Then the smile collapsed when he realized why the question had been asked. His recollection didn't move the case legally, but it breathed life back into the file. It confirmed the family had indeed possessed that caravan. That meant the burned wreck was theirs. And if it's theirs, then the bone was theirs. The next pivot came from metallurgy. The aluminum fragment with serial numbers gave up more under scanning electron microscopy. Microscopic deformation patterns confirmed digits that had been missing to the naked eye. Now the full chassis number stood complete. That sequence, run through DMV archives, returned a definitive hit: the Dawson Caravan, purchased secondhand, registered in their name, never transferred, never salvaged. The caravan found in the ravine was theirs beyond dispute. This revelation demanded a new framing of the case. For years, the dominant theory had been voluntary disappearance. The Dawsons had left their home and chosen to vanish. Some whispered of debts, of strained marriages, of a man unwilling to continue in quiet domesticity. Others favored wilderness accident, a wrong turn, exposure, bodies never recovered. Both theories have collapsed now. The family had not walked away from their lives. They had burned in a box on a mountainside. Yet questions multiplied. Why had no one reported the fire? How had the caravan remained undiscovered for more than a decade in an area searched repeatedly? The ranger explained, wildland burns are not rare in these parts. A caravan fire might be mistaken for brush igniting, and the ravine's geometry shielded the wreck from aerial searchlines. The forest has a way of eating its secrets. Still, intent had to be considered. Had the caravan burned with the family inside, killing them? Or had they died elsewhere, their remains placed here, the fire staged as cover? The single bone and decomposition chemicals suggested at least partial presence during burning. But where were the others? Forensics attempted DNA extraction from the bone. Time and heat had degraded it into fragments barely long enough for analysis. They managed a partial mitochondrial sequence, sufficient to indicate maternal lineage. Compared against a sample taken from the Dawson grandmother years before, it matched. The bone belonged to the Dawson's daughter. This confirmation hit the family with brutal finality. For years they had lived in a limbo of hope and despair, never certain if the missing were alive somewhere. Now one was proven dead, and the manner of death was shrouded in fire and secrecy. Detectives pushed back into the old witness pool. One man recalled seeing smoke on the canyon rim the week of the disappearance, but assumed it was seasonal burning. Another spoke of a pickup parked near the trailhead at odd hours. These scraps were written, cross-referenced, and flagged for follow-up. The lab's analysis of odorants concluded more firmly. The chemical markers were consistent with multiple decomposition events, not just one. This meant more than one body had likely been present. But the fragments recovered had not preserved enough material to prove it. This tension became the engine of the next phase. A burned caravan, a child's bone, chemical ghosts of bodies, but no adult remains, no clear ignition cause, and no explanation for why the vehicle sat hidden for so long. The case demanded escalation. A cold case task force was assembled, blending homicide detectives, forensic anthropologists, and wildfire specialists. Their mission was not to find survivors anymore. It was to reconstruct a crime scene that had been dying quietly in the mountains for 14 years. On the wall of their new command room, maps overlapped like layers of sediment. In red ink was the last known route of the Dawson caravan. In blue, the search grids were scoured years earlier. In black, the ravine where fire had erased and preserved at once. A circle was drawn around the canyon, wide enough to swallow half the forest. The lead investigator spoke softly, more to the room than to anyone in it. We're not chasing ghosts anymore. We're chasing fire. And fire leaves its own kind of truth. That sentence marked the line between the years of waiting and the months that would follow. months that would peel back ash to find what else had been left beneath. And somewhere in those layers lay the answer to the question that had haunted everyone since the caravan was found. Had the Dawson family died together that night, or had someone walked away from the flames? The first sweep of the command team was archival rather than physical. Fires leave not only scars in the soil, but also traces in reports, even those that never reached investigators at the time. The Wildfire Service maintained incident logs, noting each smoke sighting, each dispatch, and each extinguished spark. 14 years back, in the week the Dawson family disappeared, a minor entry appeared. Smoke column, canyon rim, dissipated before arrival. No follow-up, no suppression required. Case closed. It aligned almost perfectly with the coordinates of the ravine where the caravan was now found. The irony cut sharp. The fire had been noticed, filed, and forgotten. At the time, no one connected it to the missing family. The scale of wilderness had hidden the detail. Now, in retrospect, that thin line of ink in a forgotten log became confirmation. The caravan had burned in real time while searchers looked elsewhere. The next push was technological. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed across the ravine, the machine's antenna sweeping back and forth in precise grids. Screens showed anomalies, voids in soil density, pockets where combustion had hollowed the ground. Most corresponded to burned tree roots and collapsed ash pits. But one anomaly, deep beneath a section of melted frame, showed density different from the rest. A pit was opened. Carefully, hands and trowels replaced shovels. In layers of ash and soil, small fragments emerged. Calcined bone, brittle to the touch. They were too degraded for visual identification, but enough remained to confirm the presence of additional remains. The forensic anthropologist categorized them with clinical detachment: cranial vault fragment, rib arc, vertebral arch, all too small to be from the caravan frame itself. Each was tagged, bagged, and logged. The question no longer was if more bodies had been here. It was whose. Attention turned to the wiring harness of the caravan. Electrical fires leave telltale signs: copper beads from arcing and insulation char. Under a microscope, the wires revealed arcing consistent with current flow at the time of the fire. That suggested the caravan's electrical system had been active, not dormant. But was this accidental failure or deliberate manipulation? The report remained cautious. A short could ignite curtains, paneling, and foam. Equally, a tampered wire could do the same. The lack of accelerant meant the fire was not overtly staged. But absence of proof is not proof of absence. While forensics fought for inches, detectives widened outward. They pulled old bank records of the Dawsons. The last transaction was a fuel purchase on the road north, time-stamped less than 48 hours before the smoke report. No further card activity, no ATM withdrawals, no phone usage. Their timeline stopped dead on that purchase. Everything after was conjecture until the fire's confirmation. The neighbors from 14 years back were revisited. Some remembered the Dawsons loading the caravan with unusual haste. One recalled hearing an argument muffled through thin walls, though the words were lost to time. Rumor, not evidence. Still, it reopened a line of inquiry investigators had been reluctant to entertain. Was the fire born of accident or of domestic conflict turned catastrophic? Yet the scale of disposal contradicted the accident. If it had been mere tragedy, why had no call been made, no flare of distress sent from the ridge? Why had they not been found with the caravan at the time? The investigators held the contradiction like a blade. Either all had died together in that fire, or someone had survived long enough to walk away, leaving ash to stand in for bodies. A forensic chemist produced another clue. In soil samples under the frame, she identified residues of melted polymers, inconsistent with caravan materials. Seat foam accounted for some, panel adhesives for others. But one residue, pointed to a high-density polymer used in certain consumer products, specifically molded plastic containers. The conclusion was tentative but chilling. Something else had burned with the caravan, perhaps items carried inside, perhaps objects not belonging to it at all. Detectives retraced supply stores in the region from the year of disappearance. Purchase orders, customer logs, and even paper receipts were combed for clues about polymer containers or tarp rolls. The sweep was too wide, the years too many. Nothing conclusive surfaced. Instead, the break came from weather data. Meteorological logs showed that the week of the fire, winds had shifted abruptly, forcing smoke eastward. That accounted for why aerial searches saw nothing. The plume had bent sideways, flattened, and vanished into haze. Chance had conspired with geography to keep the caravan hidden. The family's relatives were briefed again, cautiously and respectfully. They were told that more bones had been recovered, but identities would take time. One relative asked the question none of the investigators could answer. Were they together when it happened? The silence that followed was heavier than any statement. In the lab, mitochondrial analysis of the new fragments was attempted. Some were too degraded. Others yielded sequences consistent with the maternal line, suggesting the mother or daughter. Nuclear DNA, the gold standard, was gone, burned past recognition. The fragments remained anonymous, even as they screamed their humanity. The task force faced pressure. Reclassify the disappearance as homicide or leave it unresolved. Some argued for homicide, multiple remains, hidden fire, absence of accident report. Others counseled caution without a cause. Without a clear survivor or antagonist, the file risked speculation. The official line held suspicious, unresolved, open. But on the ground, suspicion grew. A search of the ravine's approach roads revealed faint remnants of tire impressions fossilized in hardened mud. Measured and matched, they aligned not with the caravan's track width, but with a wider vehicle, likely a pickup or flatbed. Its presence near the fire zone raised dark possibilities. Had another vehicle been present that night? Had someone transported the Dawson's caravan into the ravine, staged it, ignited it, and abandoned it? The theory gained traction because of the ravine's angle. The caravan's frame had not simply rolled in. Its position suggested controlled descent, perhaps towed, then cut loose. Geometry became evidence. Reconstruction experts modeled the scenario with scaled frames. They showed that the caravan could not have reached its resting point unaided. Its weight distribution, its angle, and the way its axles bent all suggested it had been maneuvered, not accidentally crashed. That conclusion, rendered in diagrams and simulations, transformed the file. What had once looked like an accident veered sharply into a deliberate act. The Dawsons had not merely vanished into the wilderness. Their caravan had been placed, burned, and hidden. Someone had done this. The why remained absent, but the how was now undeniable. This revelation reshaped interviews with locals. Who had access to towing rigs in that year? Who moved late at night on those roads? Old disputes surfaced. A former logger recalled seeing headlights where no road should be. Another spoke of hearing grinding metal echoing from canyon walls. Each account, once dismissed, now found context. The investigation no longer hunted only for bones. It hunted for the shadow of a driver 14 years gone, a person who knew the canyon roads, who had the strength or equipment to move a caravan into a ravine, and who walked away as fire consumed the evidence. The command team drew a new circle on their map. Inside it lay not just the caravan's resting place, but the network of people who had once lived, worked, and hidden in the shadow of those mountains. And among them, investigators believed, was someone who still carried the knowledge of what happened that night. The cold case had turned into a hunt for a ghost driver. And ghosts, once pursued with evidence, have a way of leaving footprints. The theory of a second vehicle and a hidden driver shifted the investigation from quiet forensics into active pursuit. Detectives revisited property records along the canyon rim, focusing on parcels owned during the disappearance window. Old leases revealed logging outfits, seasonal cabins, and a scattering of unregistered dwellings that dotted the backcountry in that era. One stood out, a decommissioned workyard once leased to a hauling subcontractor, equipped with winches and flatbeds. The yard had gone bankrupt a year after the Dawsons vanished. Its owner had disappeared into another state, never questioned at the time. To understand if such equipment could have been used, investigators requested technical drawings of the flatbeds once registered there. They compared the axle spacing with the fossilized tire impressions pulled from the canyon soil. The alignment was chillingly close. Probability metrics suggested high correlation. 14 years had passed, but geometry preserved the ghost of machinery. A subpoena brought the old subcontractor into the room. His memory was vague, his records destroyed, but when pressed, he admitted that one of his rigs had been stolen around the same season as the Dawson disappearance. He claimed he filed a report that never led anywhere. A cross-check with the county archive found no such record. Either his paperwork vanished in bureaucratic dust, or his words bent the truth. The interview yielded suspicion, but not proof. Back at the ravine, survey teams extended their sweep further downslope. 100 yards from the main wreck, partially buried under silt from seasonal floods, they uncovered another anomaly: twisted fragments of tempered glass, tinted, thicker than Caravan windows. Laboratory tests showed composition consistent with automotive side glass, not trailer panes. This was the first physical confirmation that another vehicle had indeed shared the ravine. The forensic engineers reconstructed the shards into an approximate curvature. It matched mid-size pickups manufactured in the late 1990s. The timeline narrowed. Someone with a truck of that era had been present, perhaps involved, perhaps complicit. Investigators compiled a registry of all such vehicles registered within a 60-mile radius during the year of disappearance. Hundreds of names appeared. The process of elimination began: deaths, relocations, and sales. Each survivor on the list became a potential lead. But the canyon had another voice: the fire itself. Fire science is meticulous. Analysts built a model of ignition and spread based on the carbonized frame, the melted alloys, and the pattern of soil charring. They concluded the fire had burned hottest at the Caravan's rear axle, not the engine compartment. This contradicted the electrical short theory. Rear ignition suggested external flame introduction, perhaps accelerant, though none remained detectable after years of rain and leaching. Still, the heat pattern whispered intent. The narrative that once leaned toward tragedy now leaned toward concealment. But concealment of what? If all family members perished, who staged the scene? If one survived, why vanish? And if an outsider orchestrated it, why select this family, this vehicle, this ravine? Detectives probed the Dawson family's background for fractures. Employment records showed steady but modest work. Neighbors recalled nothing more than ordinary routines: school runs, grocery trips, and a Caravan holiday long anticipated. Financial ledgers revealed no debts, no hidden windfalls, and no disputes that screamed motive. The family seemed chosen not for what they were, but perhaps for what they happened upon. A retired fire warden added another layer. He remembered being dispatched to a minor grass fire along a spur road just days before the disappearance. The fire had been small, extinguished quickly, but he recalled unusual tracks leading away heavier than common vehicles, gouging deep ruts into damp soil. The detail was noted, ignored, and archived. Now, paired with the fossilized tire marks at the ravine, it re-emerged as connective tissue. The ravine site was revisited yet again with cadaver dogs. The ash had long been cold, the soil repeatedly washed by storms, but the dogs alerted near the frame's undercarriage. Excavation yielded fragments too small for identification, but consistent with human bone. The tally of remains grew incrementally. Each new fragment suggested that multiple individuals had been consumed by the blaze, but not all were accounted for. Gaps remained. The most haunting gap was the absence of identifiable remains for the youngest family member. Among the fragments recovered, none corresponded conclusively to a child's growth stage. Forensic anthropologists cautioned that fire can obliterate smaller bones entirely. Yet the absence lingered as a possibility. Had the child died elsewhere or survived? The family's relatives clung to the thin thread of uncertainty. Investigators, though disciplined, could not dismiss it. Meanwhile, geologists examined soil beneath the caravan for accelerant leaching. They found hydrocarbons consistent with diesel residue, but the canyon road was frequented by heavy equipment, and diesel ghosts linger everywhere. The result was ambiguous, tantalizing, but inconclusive. The investigative team faced a strategic dilemma: escalate into a homicide probe focused on locals with access to trucks and towing rigs, or continue cataloging forensic fragments in the hope of clarity. The passage of time meant both paths were treacherous. Witness memories erode, evidence degrades, yet silence corrodes more. A task force meeting ended with a decision. Both paths must proceed in parallel. One group would re-examine human remains using advanced isotope analysis to determine geographic diet signatures, in an attempt to confirm identity beyond DNA. Another group would pursue the registry of mid-1990s pickups, cross-referencing with anyone linked to hauling, logging, or fires. The caravan's resting place, once thought a grave, had become a stage on which someone had arranged metal, flame, and silence to erase a family. But fire preserves secrets as much as it destroys, and those secrets, buried under 14 years of ash, were beginning to surface. The investigators knew now that they were not chasing an accident, they were chasing orchestration. And orchestration leaves conductors. The question that loomed over every file, every map, every interview: who had conducted the fire that consumed the Dawsons? And why had it taken 14 years for the canyon to answer back? The isotope analysis began months later in a sterile laboratory hundreds of miles from the canyon. Specialists prepared the bone fragments, dissolving slivers in acid and isolating chemical signatures locked within the mineral matrix. Every bite of food, every sip of water leaves its echo in bone, creating a map of geographic life. When the results arrived, the patterns aligned. The fragments were consistent with individuals who had lived in the same Colorado basin for decades. This confirmed the remains belonged to the Dawson family, but the puzzle persisted because not every family member could be accounted for in the material extracted. Investigators compared isotope readings against dental records. 2 adults matched. 1 adolescent matched. But a gap remained where the youngest child should have been. The absence was statistical, not definitive. Fire may erase. Wind may scatter. Yet the void became gravitational, pulling speculation into its orbit. Did someone remove the child before the caravan burned? While labs tested bone dust, detectives traced the registry of mid-1990s pickups. They narrowed it to a cluster of trucks registered to logging crews operating near the canyon in the year of the disappearance. Interviews began. Retired drivers, former subcontractors. Most were startled, some evasive, and a few hostile at the reopening of old wounds. One name surfaced repeatedly: a driver known for his volatile temper, who had abruptly left the county the same winter the Dawsons vanished. He had resurfaced in another state under modest employment, leaving little trace. Detectives tracked him down. The man appeared gaunt and defensive, his pickup long gone, sold for scrap a decade earlier. When pressed, he denied ever using the canyon road. Yet his employment logs placed him within 10 miles of the site, on the very week of disappearance. Confronted, he grew silent, then combative, but offered nothing concrete. Without material evidence, his denial stood. Still, suspicion attached itself like smoke. Parallel to these confrontations, forensic engineers reconstructed the burn dynamics. They built a scaled model using identical materials, simulating ignition points. Their conclusion unsettled even seasoned investigators. The fire that consumed the Caravan had sustained heat far beyond what a spontaneous electrical blaze could generate. It required an accelerant, possibly introduced in stages. Someone had tended the fire. Someone had ensured destruction. This revelation reframed the timeline. If an accelerant was used, then the blaze was not accidental concealment. It was deliberate obliteration. The distinction mattered. Accident implies panic. Deliberation implies control. At the same time, a separate breakthrough emerged from digital archives. A graduate student researching satellite imagery for climate studies stumbled on aerial data from the year of the disappearance. Stored in low resolution and intended for vegetation analysis, the images nonetheless revealed scars on the landscape. A rectangular clearing near the canyon mouth appeared freshly disturbed in the weeks surrounding the vanishing. Soil displacement, machine tracks, then rapid overgrowth. Investigators cross-referenced this with land ownership records. The plot was tied to the same hauling subcontractor whose vehicles matched the ravine tire geometry. The ground scar had gone unexamined for over a decade, forgotten under shrubs. A field team deployed to survey. Beneath shallow layers of soil, they unearthed metallic fragments, rusted tie-down hooks, chains corroded into the earth, and scraps of tarp. The hooks were of the type used for securing heavy loads on flatbeds. The canyon had not been the only stage. The clearing had been a preparation ground. It was here, investigators theorized, that the Caravan may have been positioned, secured, and then transported. The implication was chilling. The fire site had been selected, not stumbled upon. The family's last moments were not random but routed. Forensic mapping of the tracks confirmed dual patterns, one consistent with caravan wheels, the other with a heavier vehicle dragging behind. Soil compaction data suggested simultaneous movement. The reconstruction pointed to an orchestrated convoy, a truck pulling the family into silence. Yet motive remained elusive. The Dawsons were ordinary. No debts, no enemies, no visible disputes. Why erase them? Some detectives speculated they had witnessed something unintended, an illicit operation in the backcountry, a transfer of goods, or a transaction never meant for outside eyes. Others suggested interpersonal conflict, a chance encounter with the wrong driver on the wrong road. Both remained conjecture, weightless without evidence. Meanwhile, the family's surviving relatives pressed authorities for clarity. They demanded to know if the absence of the youngest child's remains indicated survival. Investigators, careful with language, admitted only possibility. That possibility festered. Was the child abducted, spared, or obliterated in ways beyond recovery? The media seized on the ambiguity, fueling theories of survival and feeding speculation of sightings across states. Investigators fielded dozens of tips, most baseless, some cruel. Each consumed resources. Each widened shadows. But the canyon held tighter truths than rumor. The turning point came from an unlikely vector: weathered scrapings on the Caravan frame. Metallurgists analyzing corrosion noted microabrasions inconsistent with fire alone. The patterns suggested forced contact chains tightened, metal dragged. Combined with the clearing's tie-down hooks, the pieces aligned. The Dawsons had not driven into the canyon. They had been delivered into it. This truth shifted the probe from passive investigation into active homicide inquiry. The Caravan was not a tomb stumbled upon. It was an artifact of intent. The Dawsons' fate had been engineered. The case files thickened. Maps layered with routes, times, and ownerships. Charts of truck suspensions cross-referenced with soil scars. Each clue narrowed the aperture of possibility. Yet behind the lattice of data, the central absence loomed larger than ever: the missing child. If delivered into the canyon, were they delivered alone? If fire erased four, Who preserved one? And why had the canyon stayed silent for 14 years before opening its mouth? The task force pressed forward, but each breakthrough only deepened the chasm. The story was no longer of a family lost in the wilderness. It was of a family intercepted, rerouted, and consumed by fire engineered by hands still hidden in the smoke. The Caravan's relocation theory hardened into a working premise, and with it came renewed scrutiny of the drivers who had worked the timber corridor. Employment ledgers, fuel receipts, and way station slips were re-examined. One particular entry drew attention: a recorded axle weight anomaly on a flatbed passing through a way station 2 counties over, logged within days of the family's disappearance. The truck had been listed as empty, but the figures betrayed an extra load, several thousand pounds heavier than baseline. At the time, the operator offered no explanation and was waved through. 14 years later, the numbers glowed like a beacon. Detectives traced the operator. His name had surfaced before: the volatile driver who denied proximity to the canyon. Now, confronted with the way slip anomaly, his denial rang hollow. Still, without surviving physical evidence from the truck itself, prosecutors warned the case lacked the material backbone required to press charges. Circumstance, though damning, could not substitute for proof. The man remained free, his silence a brick wall. Investigators shifted again, focusing on the child. If the youngest had not perished in the fire, then somewhere there should be a trace. School records, adoption filings, medical entries. Analysts cross-matched the child's biometric data against national missing persons registries. They found no direct match, but in the blurred lines of foster systems and undocumented placements, the gaps yawned wide. Forensic genealogists entered the fold. Using preserved Dawson DNA, they constructed family profiles and seeded them into commercial ancestry databases. They hoped that if the child survived, now an adult, a distant genetic echo might surface. The process was slow, methodical, and fraught with ethical landmines. Months passed with no hit. But the mere act of search forced investigators to confront the chilling possibility. The child had been absorbed into another life, stripped of name, severed from lineage. Meanwhile, the metallurgists continued their microanalysis. They discovered not only chain abrasions but also traces of an unusual polymer fused to the Caravan's frame. Laboratory breakdown identified it as a specialized resin used in industrial tarp coatings, a resin rare in consumer products. Investigators compared this signature against purchase records, focusing on rural supply stores within a 100-mile radius. Out of dozens of distributors, only one carried the exact polymerized batch. From there, the inquiry narrowed to customers. Among them, the same subcontractor already linked to the canyon clearing. This was no coincidence. This was chain of custody evidence binding the physical artifact to the suspect. Search warrants were drafted. Detectives scoured the subcontractor's former yards, now overgrown with weeds and graffiti. Beneath the cracked concrete of a disused shed, they unearthed remnants: resin-coated tarp strips, tie-down hooks, and a ledger fragment noting truck rotations. One notation chilled investigators: special load west route. The date aligned precisely with the Dawson disappearance. What special load meant remained unsaid, but the canyon provided its own translation. The suspect driver was re-interviewed. Presented with the resin evidence, the ledger, and the way station anomaly, he faltered, his story fractured. He admitted hauling a damaged trailer on that date, but insisted he had no knowledge of its contents. When pressed, he grew agitated, claiming orders came from above, from a supervisor now deceased. His narrative spiraled into contradictions. First, claiming the load was abandoned property, then that it was fire salvage. Detectives documented every inconsistency. Yet, in the absence of a confession, the question remained: why? Why abduct an entire family, transport them under a tarp, and burn them into obscurity? What purpose did it serve? Some investigators posited mistaken identity, that the Dawson's caravan resembled another target, caught in a net not meant for them. Others whispered darker theories, that the family witnessed a transfer of contraband, or stumbled into visibility on a route not meant for civilian eyes. Either scenario explained the motive for erasure. Neither restored the missing child. Then came the soil cores. From beneath the caravan fire pit, geologists extracted sediment layer by layer. Beneath the char, they found faint imprints of smaller shoe treads, inconsistent with adult boots. The impressions were incomplete, partial arcs and edges preserved in compacted ash. But measured against forensic shoe databases, they aligned with child footwear. The prints trailed only a few feet before vanishing in the churn of larger tracks. The implication was devastating. The child had been present during relocation, walked briefly near the fire site, then disappeared from the record. Whether taken away or consumed elsewhere, the truth eluded capture. Public interest surged again. News outlets resurrected the Dawson story, framing it as both tragedy and enigma. The surviving relatives clung to the prints as proof of survival, demanding broader searches. Volunteers combed adjacent canyons. Drone surveys scanned ridgelines, and cadaver dogs traced old fire breaks. Nothing surfaced. The canyon remained mute. In the task force's war room, maps overlapped like palimpsests. String lines traced routes from the Dawson home to the canyon, to the subcontractor's yard, to the way station slip. Each line intersected, converging on the same shadowed core. A company dissolved, a supervisor deceased, and a driver unwilling or unable to tell the full story. And still, the open loop lingered. The fire exploded 4 times. The caravan explained transport. The resin explained the method. But the prints whispered survival. Were they fleeting echoes, footprints into oblivion? Or was it a path abruptly diverted, leading into a life no one ever traced? The canyon held its silence. The investigation pressed on. The soil evidence had given the case new breath, but with it came sharper divisions inside the task force. Some argued that the child's prints were simply residue from before the caravan was burned, that all 5 had perished together, their remains dispersed in ways untraceable after so many years. Others held firm that the evidence spoke differently. Those small arcs imprinted in ash were too distinct and too proximate to the fire event itself to be relics of an earlier time. The difference was more than academic. It dictated where the search should go next, toward memorial closure, or toward a hunt for the missing. Investigators pivoted toward the human element. They re-interviewed anyone who had been within the Dawson's orbit 14 years earlier: neighbors, roadside vendors, and fuel station clerks. Memory after so long was brittle, warped by time and retelling. Most recalled nothing new, but one statement, long buried in the original file, resurfaced. A camper parked near a trail spur off the highway remembered seeing a man loading something awkward into a flatbed late at night. He had dismissed it then as a hunter-moving game. The recollection, though vague, now resonated with the caravan relocation theory. Detectives sought corroboration through logistics. The subcontractor's ledgers, though fragmentary, revealed repeated late-night fuel withdrawals logged under generic codes. One date aligned with the way station anomaly. Another, weeks later, coincided with unaccounted travel in the same corridor. If the caravan was the first special load, what had been the second? That unanswered question gnawed at the team. Forensic accountants joined, charting the subcontractor's cash flows. Buried within invoices were payments from shell companies dissolved within a year. The paper trail was intentionally murky, designed to evaporate. But one payment carried a bank routing number traceable to a holding entity tied to abandoned timber leases. The amounts were substantial, not the wages of moving derelict trailers, but compensation for something riskier, hidden. The narrative was coalescing. The Dawson caravan had intersected with a transport network that trafficked in shadows. Whether smuggling contraband, weapons, or hazardous material, the family's mere presence had made them liabilities. And in that calculus, the simplest solution was obliteration. Yet obliteration had gaps. The child's prints remained a wound. To probe that wound, genealogists re-upped their work. New database uploads offered fresh cross-matches. Weeks later, a hit emerged, not direct, but suggestive. A young adult in the Southwest had submitted DNA for ancestry purposes. The genetic profile carried markers consistent with a first-degree Dawson relative. The probability was high enough to warrant a covert inquiry. Detectives traveled discreetly, armed with court orders. They located the individual, a woman in her late teens. She had been raised in foster care, cycling through placements with scant documentation. Her records began in 2005, 2 years after the Dawson disappearance. Her earliest memories were fragmented. A caretaker who spoke of finding her, a blanket she later lost, and a name she had not been born with. When confronted with the DNA evidence, she sat silent, tears welling before she could form words. She had never known her origin, only the void where her story should have been. The tests confirmed what investigators already suspected. She was the Dawsons' surviving child. The revelation rewrote the case. 4 had died in the fire. 1 had been taken, reabsorbed into the folds of anonymity. How she survived and why she was spared demanded reconstruction. The woman's fragmented memories, though fragile, held faint clues. She recalled a long drive at night, the rattle of chains outside, and the smell of diesel. She remembered being handed to a woman she did not know, in a place that smelled of dust and livestock. After that, her timeline blurred until the foster system claimed her. Detectives cross-referenced those fragments. The mention of livestock pointed toward rural holdings in the Southwest. The diesel and the chains are already tied to the subcontractor's fleet. Piece by piece, her recollections dovetailed with physical evidence. The driver, re-interviewed with this new fact, broke further. And pressed with the proof that the child had survived, he admitted under oath that he had not killed her. Orders had come. Remove her from the fire site and deliver her to a contact. He claimed ignorance of who the contact was, only that the transfer absolved him of a deed he refused to carry out. The confession reframed the crime not only as erasure, but also as a transaction. 4 lives consumed to protect secrecy. 1 life diverted into obscurity, as if collateral with no record. The Caravan's burned husk had always been the centerpiece of the mystery. Now it was only half the truth. The greater crime extended beyond the canyon into networks of concealment that stretched across state lines. And yet, even as resolution dawned, another shadow persisted. Who had issued the orders? Who stood above the driver, the subcontractor, and the ledger entries? 14 years had dulled many trails, and some names lay buried with supervisors long dead. The masterminds behind the fire remained cloaked. The woman, now named again with her family's surname, became both survivor and unanswered question. She had lived while the rest had not. But why her? And at what cost? Investigators closed their files with as much certainty as evidence allowed. The Dawsons had not vanished into the wilderness by accident. They had been consumed in a calculated act of concealment, their caravan a coffin designed to erase. Only 1 thread had frayed from the fire. A child carried into another life. That thread had now been found. But the loom that wove the crime remained in darkness. The canyon stayed silent. The caravan stayed blackened. And in the silence, 1 question endured. If the system could erase a family so thoroughly, how many others had been consumed without trace? The discovery of the surviving Dawson child reshaped not only the case, but also the narrative that had defined it for 14 years. Where once the caravan was the end point, now it became the prologue to a larger system of disappearance and concealment. Investigators faced the delicate task of balancing closure with pursuit, knowing that for the family's surviving member, the answers offered both balm and wound. Reconstructing the caravan's final days, forensic analysts layered together data points like sediment. The way station log confirmed transport along a precise corridor. Satellite imagery archives revealed faint discolorations at a rest stop turnout marks, consistent with prolonged parking of heavy vehicles. The fuel ledgers placed a flatbed on that route in the same window. Each fragment corroborated the larger outline. The Dawson caravan had been towed deliberately, away from public view, into the canyon where it was later incinerated. But the motive remained slippery. Why annihilate 4 members yet spare the youngest? Some investigators believed it was accidental. Someone's hesitation crystallized in the final moment, a refusal to kill an infant. Others suspected utilitarian logic. Removing her provided leverage, insurance, or perhaps a cruel show of power. The absence of clarity gnawed at the case file margins. The survivor's testimony, though fractured by time and trauma, added layers of complexity. She remembered not only livestock, diesel, and chains, but also a faint jingling sound, like tools or keys whenever her captor moved. She recalled a tattoo on the forearm of the man who drove her, a design she could only describe as a bird with broken wings. That detail, vague yet distinct, prompted an archival search through mugshots of known associates tied to the subcontractor. It took weeks, but eventually a match surfaced. A former mechanic connected to the fleet, arrested years later on unrelated charges. His tattoo, partially blurred in grainy photos, resembled her description. The link was circumstantial, but it lent weight to her memory and placed another individual within the orbit of her abduction. Still, the upper echelons of the network remained unreachable. Records tied to the shell companies dissolved into offshore voids. Supervisors either denied knowledge or had died in intervening years. The crime, once searingly present, now lived half in living memory, half in unreachable shadows. Legal proceedings moved forward with the evidence available. The subcontractor's former driver faced charges of manslaughter, conspiracy, and destruction of evidence. His testimony, reluctant but unavoidable, anchored the prosecution. The defense argued coercion, presenting him as a man trapped by orders from faceless powers. The court weighed complicity against survival and duty against morality. In the end, he was convicted and sentenced to decades behind bars. For the survivor, the verdict was both victory and loss. She had wanted names, faces, and the full ledger of those responsible. What she received instead was partial justice, a narrowed figurehead standing in for a faceless system. The caravan itself, once just debris, became central in the courtroom. Photos of its charred frame, preserved in sterile clarity, were displayed before the jury. Forensic experts explained how heat gradients revealed accelerant use, how soil samples confirmed relocation, and how tire impressions sealed the link to the subcontractor's fleet. Each detail reconstructed the fire as an intentional act, not an accident. In the gallery, Odelia Dawson's surviving relative sat stone-faced, absorbing the translation of grief into technical terminology. For them, the photographs were not evidence but memory of laughter around a campfire, of road trips where the caravan had been a sanctuary, not a coffin. Beyond the courtroom, the case rippled outward. Policy reviews targeted subcontractor oversight, exposing how shadow networks exploited gaps in regulation. Journalists traced connections between similar disappearances. Some confirmed accidents, others suddenly suspect. The Dawson story became not just a family tragedy but a lens onto systemic neglect. And yet, with every layer of truth, new absences opened. The location of the other bodies consumed in the fire remained unmarked by headstones. The question of why the child alone was spared had no definitive answer. The higher figures who orchestrated the caravan's incineration never faced cross-examination. For the survivor, now an adult, life is divided into 2 strata, before and after the revelation. She took back her surname, inscribing it on forms and identifications where once an alias had sat. But identity, she realized, was not just a name. It was lineage, photographs, stories, pieces denied to her forever. The canyon remained untouched, a scar in the earth. Visitors passed its overlook, unaware of what the blackened soil beneath had once concealed. Investigators revisited it occasionally, not for new evidence, but to ensure it was remembered. A crime scene with no memorial is a silence too easily forgotten. One detective, nearing retirement, summarized the unresolved ache. "We found her, but we didn't find them." His words carried both triumph and failure, encapsulating the paradox of cold cases brought to partial light. The Caravan had answered some questions, but it had also buried others deeper, and in that canyon silence, investigators faced the enduring truth. Justice, when fractured, can illuminate without ever fully healing. The final accounting of the Dawson disappearance was not a single moment, but a series of quiet reckonings spread across months and years. Courtrooms emptied, files were archived, and the survivor, once the infant carried unknowingly into the heart of the fire, stood as the living ledger of everything lost. The system had given her fragments, a name restored, partial justice, and a conviction. What it could not return were the absences that still shaped every corner of her life. For investigators, the case was a reminder of the limits of certainty. The forensic record ended at the Caravan's perimeter. Beyond that line stretched decisions made by people who had since dissolved into shadows. Men whose signatures authorized transports, whose silence sanctioned concealment. Their presence was everywhere in implication and nowhere in accountability. Each unanswered call, each missing document, was itself an indictment, but one that would never see trial. The survivor spoke sparingly in public. When she did, her words carried a gravity forged in silence. She described how she remembered a jingle of keys, the feel of rough tarp, and the way diesel hung in the air like a second atmosphere. For her, these were not fragments of evidence. They were her inheritance, the contours of memory she would never escape. She did not ask for pity, only acknowledgement that the story belonged not only to investigators and journalists, but to her body, her mind, and her sense of home. Communities along the route where the Caravan last traveled began their own form of reckoning. Locals, who once dismissed the disappearance as an accident, now spoke of the canyon in hushed tones. For them, it was not just a physical place, but a cautionary symbol. How quickly people can vanish when oversight falters, and how long it takes for silence to fracture. The terrain itself, scarred and overgrown, bore witness in its own way. Rain etched furrows into the ash, moss colonized the metal husk, and saplings rose where fire had once consumed. Nature moved forward, but always around, never erasing. Investigators who had once followed every lead with relentless urgency now reflected on what the case had taught them. They spoke of patience measured not in hours or days, but in years. They spoke of anomalies, a soil stain, a fuel ledger that seemed trivial in isolation, yet, when threaded together, unraveled the story. Above all, they spoke of the weight borne by families, how the absence of answers could feel heavier than grief itself. The Dawson file closed with a paradox. On one hand, the fire was explained, the perpetrators partially named, and the survivor identified. On the other, 3 members of the family would forever remain unmarked by graves, their remains consumed or concealed beyond recovery. The absence itself became their memorial. For the survivor, adulthood carried a unique burden, to live not only for herself, but also for those whose lives were extinguished before hers could even begin. She pursued education, work, and relationships under the shadow of knowledge that every milestone, graduation, marriage, a child's birth would echo with names unspoken. Yet in that echo lay strength, a determination to exist as proof that the Caravan fire had not consumed everything. When asked once what justice meant to her, she answered with a stillness that lingered long after the words. Justice is knowing they did not vanish. They were taken, and someone, somewhere, remembers. The canyon remains off-limits now, officially classified as hazardous terrain. But for those who know the story, it is not the soil that is toxic, it is the silence. The blackened husk of the Caravan lies beneath layers of dirt, unmarked. Yet investigators occasionally return. They stand at its edge, not expecting new evidence, but because remembering is itself a duty. The Dawson disappearance closed on paper, yet in lived experience it remains open. The unanswered kernel persists. Why was one child spared when the rest were not? Was it mercy, hesitation, or calculation? That question remains suspended, a reminder that even when cases find resolution, they rarely find completeness. And in that tension lies the haunting truth of every long-forgotten file resurrected by chance. The past is never fully buried. It waits in soil, in ash, in memory, until someone looks close enough to see what was always there. The caravan burned, but the story endures. And as with every story we tell here, if you want to continue exploring the hidden truths that surface from silence, consider subscribing. It ensures these voices, even fractured and incomplete, are never lost again.